Hello, everyone. If you joined our service last week, we were having some technical difficulties as we entered the sanctuary for the first time in 15 months. And so I've taken the liberty of re-recording the sermon here for you to enjoy. I hope that this blesses you this week. Good morning, Evergreen Online. Today we have made the noticeable step of live streaming our service from our sanctuary for the first time in 16 months. So thank you to Mitch, Lester, and the tech volunteers for working to get us back in here. Our last service here was our first service in lockdown. Only a few of the staff were here along with some of our Family Promise volunteers. This month we'll be testing some of our new equipment and bringing in a few of our tech volunteers to get this place ready for our anticipated in-person gatherings in September. Now, of course, everything will be determined by how the pandemic continues to play out. But in the meantime, we hope that the visual environment of this space will help create a worshipful experience in your homes. I also want to ask you to consider volunteering for our re-entry. We are looking for people who can help run our health check-in stations for those who decide to come join us on campus. We will provide you, if you volunteer, with some simple training to help us welcome people onto campus in a safe way. Now, if we can't get volunteers, it's simple. We can't open up. So please email me if you would like to help. You can also expect that our sanctuary re-entry will be gradual. We'll have limited capacity at first, then increase our numbers based on recommendations from our re-entry committee. More information about what to expect will be released in August. Now, last week, we had a wonderful turnout at our Church in the Park gathering in Arcadia as a way for us to gather safely even as our sanctuary is being prepared. It was wonderful to see so many of you. So many that I didn't get to talk to most of the group. But if you didn't get to talk to friends like I did, we are planning to have one last Church in the Park for the end of summer on August 29th. This will be the week before our expected sanctuary re-entry on the first week of September. And so I hope you'll mark your calendars and join us for that gathering. Now, if you're just joining us, this summer we are in a series called Crossing Jordan, where we are looking at Israel's journey in the opening chapters of Joshua as they prepare to cross the Jordan River into the Promised Land. We're using this story as an inspirational narrative for us on our journey of re-entry here as a church. The idea is that God's been transforming all of us over the past 15 months, and instead of leaving that change in quarantine, we want to integrate that into our lives going forward. And so we're trying to be very intentional about our re-entry, because we believe that God is doing something in us, even in this transitional time. Each week, we've also been commemorating the journey with the stacking of stones, just as Israel did when they entered Canaan. We've moved that evolving monument into the sanctuary here with us, where we will add to it later in the service. Now we pick up our story with the introduction of a new character, Rahab. As the Israelites prepare to cross over into Canaan, Joshua sends 2 spies into the land to get more intel. Now, some of you may remember that this has happened before in the book of Numbers. That time, Moses sends spies into the land for 40 days. Joshua, along with Caleb, are part of that group of spies. And when that group of spies comes back, Caleb reports that Israel can take possession of the land. But the other spies think that the inhabitants of Canaan are much too strong. And so they tell the Israelites that there are huge people living in the land that make all the Israelites look like grasshoppers. And so obviously everyone gets scared, and that attempt to enter the land is unsuccessful. Now this time, Joshua sends only 2 spies into the land, and they go to stay at the house of a prostitute named Rahab. Now before we go on, I want to talk just a little bit about Rahab. Rahab lives in a house that was a part of the defensive wall of Jericho. A house built into the outer defensive wall tells us that this was not prime real estate. This is at the edge of the city. So it would see all the traffic flowing in and out of the city, sort of like living next to a freeway. There's just a lot of people coming in and coming out. It did, however, make her house a great place to hear gossip and the word on the street. This is possibly one of the reasons why the spies chose this house to lodge in when they entered Jericho. Most of our translations now will identify Rahab as a prostitute or some type of sex worker. There is a variant translation that identifies her as an innkeeper, and possibly her place could have doubled maybe as both inn and brothel. But however we want to translate it, I think what's clear is that she isn't presented as having a desirable vocation. Now, I don't want to get into painting Rahab as a sinful person because I'm assuming that she was a part of a broader system of brokenness in Jericho, and I suspect she was forced into this work through some uncontrollable circumstances. What is interesting, though, is that she had a degree of power. For instance, this was her house, whether it was an inn or a brothel, and she's the one that's presented as making deals and communicating with both the spies of Joshua and the king in the story. That tells me that she was not just a nobody. She was someone that had a degree of authority in her world. Now, those of you who've seen the show Warrior about the Tong Wars in 1849 San Francisco Chinatown, she reminds me of the character Ah Toy. Now, Ah Toy was a real-life madam over a chain of brothels in San Francisco during the gold rush, and she became one of the most famous and richest Asian women in the Old West. Because of her work, she knows all the shady dealings that are going on in the city. But because of her wealth, she actually has the power to negotiate with people in authority in order to benefit her. Now, this is just my own imagination, but I picture Rahab similarly. Maybe her inn was a brothel, but maybe her notoriety was what made her stand out to both King of Jericho and the spies of Israel. The significant thing about her identification as a sex worker is what it represents, though, in the Old Testament. The word to describe her can translate to the phrase, one who strays. Essentially, one who is unfaithful to a spouse or to God. Now, the characterization of a prostitute in the Bible is often used as an analogy for someone who is unfaithful to God, or in the case of Israel, an entire nation that is unfaithful to God. Now, this could mean that Rahab may have just been a worshiper of a Canaanite god, or just generally she was someone who was unfaithful to Yahweh, didn't have any connection to Yahweh. But this characterization as being unfaithful and untrustworthy that the scriptures paint Rahab with is actually critical to the story. And if she is as notorious as Ah Toy from 1849 Chinatown, that makes her reputation for being unfaithful even bigger. Everybody knew who she was and what she did, and that made her kind of notorious for being one who strays. And I want us to hold on to that thought for just a second as we dive back into the text. And the king of Jericho finds out about the spies and orders Rahab to present these men to his cronies that he sends to her house. So Rahab hides the spies on her roof underneath some stalks of flax. Rahab plays dumb to the king. She tells him, well, she had no idea where they came from and that the men had already left and gone outside the city gate. Now, because of Rahab's misleading information, the king's men leave the city gates in pursuit of the spies. Now, after they leave, Rahab goes to the spies on her roof and tells them that everyone in the land is afraid because everyone's heard of the mighty deeds of this Israelite God, about the crossing of the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds, and the military victories of Israel. Everyone is terrified that the Israelites are preparing to cross the Jordan River to take the land. And so in Joshua 2, Rahab makes this deal with the spies. And she says, now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. Our lives for your lives, the men assured her. If you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. So she let them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. She said to them, go to the hills so the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until they return, and then go on your way." Now the men had said to her, "This oath you made us swear will not be binding on us, unless, when we enter the land, you have tied the scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you have brought your father and mother, your brothers, and all your family into your house. If any of them go outside your house into the street, their blood will be on their own heads. We will not be responsible. As for those who are in the house with you, their blood will be on our head if a hand is laid on them. But if you tell what we are doing, we will be released from the oath you made us swear." "Agreed," she replied. "Let it be as you say." Rahab is negotiating a deal with the Israelite spies to secure the safety of her entire household, her whole extended family. It is significant because this oath is made by a prostitute, the person the text identifies as unfaithful, one who strays. Do you see the irony of that? And yet, the success of this entire spy mission depends on Rahab's faithfulness. It shows Rahab to be someone who indeed can be trusted, and someone who indeed can be included in God's people. In fact, even in the New Testament, James recognizes her as an example of faith when he says this in chapter 2. Starting at verse 25. "In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead." Now Rahab comes back into the story a few chapters later in Joshua. At the end of Joshua 6, the priests and army are marching around the city of Jericho, and the walls crumble to the ground. As the army charges into the city, this is what Joshua tells those two spies. Starting at verse 22. "Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, 'Go into the prostitute's house and bring her out, and all who belong to her, in accordance with your oath to her.' So the men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother, her brothers and sisters, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it, but they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day." Rahab was the most unlikely person to be included in this covenant community of Israel. She was labeled and seen as unfaithful, as untrustworthy, perhaps even unworthy. And yet the journey across the Jordan would have been a total loss without her. God and the nation of Israel recognized her faithfulness. And the story ends with the line, "And she lives among the Israelites to this day." Now, what a phenomenal ending. The harlot is now practically a Hebrew, living among the nation as a member and part of the family of God. God had just finished allowing, remember, a whole generation of unfaithful Israelites die off before entering the promised land. And yet here Rahab and her family and everyone that belonged to her were the most unlikely people to be included in Israel's journey into the promised land. Now, what this tells me is that as Israel embarks on their journey of re-entry, the newness they encounter when entering the promised land is not just the new geography that they see or feel underneath their feet. The newness of this land also extends to the makeup of their community. God is adding new people to their numbers. For our journey of re-entry, this is something I believe we encounter too. When we entered lockdown 16 months ago, we knew who was with us. But a lot has happened over the last year and a half. Some have passed. Others in our community have left. The other day I was talking to some friends of mine who are also pastors of churches in Southern California. And they told me that as they have been opening up their churches, they became aware that people had left their congregations as well. It's not just our church, it's many churches. It seems the pandemic was a good excuse for some people to make some long wanted changes in their communities. But we have also gained people. And sometimes the same things that have caused people to leave in the pandemic have attracted others to our community and church family. A few weeks ago, we welcomed our largest membership class to the church in years. And I also know there are those of you who have joined us online in the pandemic from other parts of the city, other parts of the country, and other parts of the world. When we come back to a gathered community in a few months, Lord willing, the makeup of our congregation might be a little different. And you might find yourself sitting next to some unlikely friends. Our queer evergreeners might find themselves worshiping next to some more conservative evergreeners. Our Republican evergreeners might be worshiping next to some Democrat evergreeners. Our vaccinated evergreeners might be worshiping next to our unvaccinated evergreeners, with masks, of course. And you might find that the very person sitting next to you is your Rahab. But that's okay, because I'm pretty sure you'll be theirs. Rahab's story reminds us that as God leads us into new seasons of life, God will bring unexpected people into those seasons. And instead of trying to keep the community the same as it has always been, we should look for the Rahabs, the people of unexpected blessing that God has chosen to include. Because God's not taking us back to who we were. He's leading us forward to who we will be. Beloved, may our eyes, our hearts, and our arms be opened to embrace, to include, and to receive the new and unlikely friends that God brings into our community. And even as we grieve those who are gone, we eagerly anticipate those who have come and the blessing that God will bring through them. God bless you all.